Hi everyone. St. John Chrysostom, when he was Patriarch of Constantinople, had a certain cell attendant. Well, not quite a cell attendant, but someone who was there to make the Patriarch's life a little bit easier, who would control the flow of people coming to see him, these sorts of duties. And at one point in time, there was a high official who had apparently crossed the emperor. The emperor, therefore, had this man's property confiscated and had basically told him that he was going to be executed. Well, this disturbed the man to no end, as you can well imagine, and so he made his way to the Patriarch in order to see if St. John could do anything for him at all. And so he encountered this servant of St. John's and said, "Look, I've got to see him. This is really, really a desperate time. Please get me in to see him if you can." And the man said, "Sure, I will do it. I understand the difficulty, and I will ask Despota if he can make time for you." And so he informed St. John of this, and St. John said, "Well, okay, I understand. Then, come and find me perhaps tonight after Compline, and I can talk with him then." So this servant did so, and he came back, and he found that the door was closed after Compline, which was a little bit unusual, and he wondered what was going on. It didn't seem like anyone was there. So he opened the door a little bit to kind of peek in and see if our Holy Patriarch was there. And indeed he was. He was writing at his desk, and it seemed like there was some distinguished personage, a very reverent-looking man who was balding, who was standing behind St. John and talking to him, whispering in his ear. Well, the man thought, he's busy now, there's nothing I can do, and so he went out and came back a little bit later. And the same thing happened. And this rolled over into the next day, when, after several times, and finding the man still there, he was rather exasperated. In fact, the servant was a little bit miffed at all of this, because he thought he had set up a time with St. John. And so he goes to the man who had the trouble with the emperor and said, "Look, I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. He's had this person in there all this time, and you might just have to fend for yourself here. I don't know." And the man, of course, was very distraught, but said that he would, do the best that he could, but still hoped that the Holy Patriarch might be able to see him. Well, finally, he goes back in, and yet once again sees this man whispering to St. John. And he thought, well, how long is this going to go on? But then he decided to try one more time. And he went in, and he saw St. John again sitting at his desk, but there was no one around. And he mentioned to St. John that, there was a man who wanted to see him, and St. John looked at him in astonishment and said, "Well, I thought we had set up a time, but you never came in. What's the problem here?" And the servant said, "Well, wait a minute. I've been back here 5, maybe even 10 times, and I saw somebody here with you who was speaking to you. He was whispering in your ear." And St. John was a little perplexed by this. So St. John said, "Well, do you have any idea who this is?" And the man said, "No." And then he happened to gaze up across from the writing desk that St. John was at, and he saw an icon of the Holy Apostle Paul. And he said to St. John, "This man that was here, he seems to look almost exactly like St. Paul does in this icon." And St. John was quite astonished for a moment. And he sat there and thought, finally, I get an answer from the Lord. You see, because St. John had been very devoted to St. Paul and absolutely adored his epistles and wanted to expound on them as much as he could, but was curious as to whether what he was saying was genuine. Was it really getting the ideas in St. Paul's writings across to people? And by this incident, St. John realized that indeed he was, because it was St. Paul whom this man had seen whispering into St. John Chrysostom's ear. St. John Chrysostom, of course, has written many, many things about the epistles of St. Paul, and in fact is known in the Orthodox Church as the voice of St. Paul. Well, the man who was trying so hard to get St. John Chrysostom's attention is actually the one that we talk about today, because on November 20th, the Holy Orthodox Church commemorates this man, and his name is Proklos. Now, Proklos was a devoted servant of St. John his entire life, breathing the air he breathed and inheriting the spirit of St. John as well. So much so that he actually ended up being consecrated a bishop. So Proklos, after he had been consecrated, went to assume his see, but yet he found that he was not wanted there, because in the meanwhile, the powers that be had already consecrated another bishop for that see. So he returned back to Constantinople, where he stayed for a number of years, until finally, after the death of one of the patriarchs, the synod there elected him as Patriarch of Constantinople. This was during a difficult time in the church, because St. Proklos was actually the second Patriarch of Constantinople after the infamous Nestorius. In fact, Proklos had given a sermon in Hagia Sophia about the dangers of Nestorius's doctrine, calling the Mother of God Theotokos, not Christotokos, and indeed he went on to expound eloquently about the two natures of Christ, because he would write against Theodore of Mopsuestia and others who would come later, stirring up trouble and causing that heresy in the church. So we see that Proklos' stewardship of Constantinople was a beautiful thing. His stewardship of the Orthodox Church was a beautiful thing, and all the years that he had spent with St. John bore fruit in these incidences that he had to defend the Orthodox faith. So many people know the story of St. John and St. Paul whispering in his ear. Many people know that there was a man, even that his name was Proklos, that was watching this. But not many understand that Proklos himself went on to be a venerable, honored bishop in the church, now a saint, who reposed in peace not long after the era of St. John Chrysostom. May we also pay attention, as Proklos did, to St. Paul, who expounds so wonderfully about all things Orthodox in his epistles. And may the prayers of St. Proklos, along with St. John Chrysostom, guide us always truly into the Orthodox faith. Bye-bye.